Jake Turner never imagined he'd risk his life for a bear. But here he was, clinging to a rope on a windswept cliff, trying to rescue a predator that could kill him in seconds. Below him, the grizzly dangled helplessly, claws scrabbling against the rock face, a mix of raw power and desperation. What kind of man does this? Jake wondered. What kind of fool bets everything on a creature that might not even understand what he's doing? Yet, as the bear's dark eyes met his, something in them ignited a resolve Jake didn't know he had. It wasn't supposed to be this kind of day. Jake had set out into the mountains for peace, to clear his head after weeks of restless nights. The weight of life's struggles, his failing business, the recent death of his father, had pressed down on him like an avalanche. Nature had always been his refuge, a place where problems seemed small and the vastness of the world reminded him he wasn't alone. But fate had other plans. A low, guttural cry had shattered the stillness of the afternoon, freezing him in his tracks. At first, he thought it was a trick of the wind. Then it came again, a sound unlike anything he'd ever heard, a mix of a roar and a desperate plea. Curiosity pulled him off the trail and into the wilderness. Pushing through dense brush, his boots crunching over dry leaves, he followed the sound until he found the cliff's edge. That's when he saw it, a young grizzly, stranded on a narrow ledge halfway down the sheer rock face. Jake's heart had lurched. The bear's powerful body was battered, its fur matted with blood from a gash on its shoulder. It must have slipped while trying to climb, or maybe it had been chased. Either way, it was trapped, with no way to climb back up or down. He should have walked away. Any rational person would have. Bears were dangerous, unpredictable. Helping it was reckless, maybe even suicidal. But something about the way it struggled, the way it clawed at the rock with a mix of determination and despair, struck a chord deep in Jake's chest. So here he was, with a makeshift rope tied around his waist, his life in the balance as he tried to save a creature that might not even understand his intentions. The rope creaked under the strain, a harsh sound that sent a chill down Jake's spine. His arms trembled, his muscles screaming for relief as he fought to keep his grip. He planted his feet on the rocky ground, his boots scraping against loose gravel. The wind whipped at his face, carrying the scent of pine and the metallic tang of his own sweat. "Hold on," Jake muttered, though the words were more for himself than the bear. The grizzly let out a guttural growl, its claws scrabbling against the rock as it struggled to find purchase. Jake's stomach clenched. The bear was too heavy. If he lost control, they'd both go over the edge. A gust of wind slammed into him, nearly throwing him off balance. He gritted his teeth and pulled harder, his hands burning against the rough rope. Inch by inch, he hauled the bear closer to safety, his body screaming in protest with every movement. Finally, with one last desperate heave, the bear scrambled onto the ledge. Its massive body collapsed onto its side, its chest heaving as it sucked in air. Jake staggered back, dropping to his knees. His vision swam, black spots dancing at the edges of his sight. For a long moment, the two of them just sat there, man and beast, both too exhausted to move. The bear's dark eyes flicked toward Jake, and for a heartbeat, their gazes locked. Jake felt a jolt of something he couldn't quite name, respect, maybe, or understanding. The bear huffed softly, its breath misting in the cool air. It wasn't a growl or a snarl. If Jake didn't know any better, he might have thought it was gratitude. The moment was broken by a sharp crack echoing through the canyon. Jake's head snapped up, his eyes darting to the cliffs above. Rocks tumbled down the slope, dislodged by something, or someone. A shadow moved along the ridge, dark against the gray sky. Jake's pulse quickened. He wasn't alone. The bear growled low in its throat, its ears flattening against its head. It pushed itself to its feet, its massive frame radiating tension. Jake slowly stood as well, his legs shaky beneath him. He didn't know who, or what, was up there, but he had a sinking feeling that rescuing the bear was only the beginning of his problems. Another crack rang out, louder this time, and Jake flinched. It wasn't the sound of rocks falling. It was gunfire. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. His eyes scanned the ridge, searching for the source of the shot. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man dressed in camouflage with a rifle slung over his shoulder. Jake's heart sank. "Poachers!" The man shouted something, his voice barely audible over the wind. Jake couldn't make out the words, but the intent was clear. The bear was a target, and Jake was in the way. The bear let out a roar that echoed through the canyon, its teeth bared as it faced the hunter. Jake's mind raced. He had no weapon, no way to defend himself or the bear. All he had was his wits and a rope that had already been pushed to its limit. The poacher raised his rifle, taking aim. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had seconds to act. "Run!" he shouted, waving his arms to get the bear's attention. The grizzly hesitated, its instincts warring with its exhaustion. Another shot rang out, and a chunk of rock exploded near Jake's feet. The bear growled, but this time it didn't stay still. With a burst of energy, it turned and bolted, disappearing into the trees. Jake wasn't far behind. Adrenaline surged through his veins as he sprinted toward the forest, the sound of boots crunching on gravel close behind. The poacher was giving chase, and Jake knew he couldn't outrun a man with a gun. His only hope was the bear. Jake's lungs burned as he sprinted into the dense forest, his heart pounding like a drum. Twigs snapped under his boots, and low-hanging branches whipped at his face and arms. Behind him, the sound of the poacher crashing through the undergrowth grew louder. Jake had no plan, no idea where he was going. All he knew was that he couldn't stop. The bear had vanished into the wilderness, its massive form surprisingly silent. Jake wasn't sure if it was smart enough to stay away from the poacher or if it had simply followed its instincts. Either way, he hoped the grizzly was far enough away to be safe. A sharp crack split the air. Jake flinched, diving behind a fallen log as a bullet tore through the trees above him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with adrenaline. "Stop running!" The poacher's voice rang out, rough and angry. "You're making this harder than it has to be." Jake pressed himself against the log, his mind racing. Why was the man chasing him? The bear was gone. Wasn't that what he wanted? Then it hit him. The poacher must have seen Jake rescue the bear. Maybe he thought Jake was some kind of wildlife activist or a threat to his operation. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Jake's pulse quickened. He couldn't stay here. Peering over the log, he spotted a narrow game trail winding deeper into the forest. It wasn't much, but it was his only option. Jake took a deep breath and bolted, his legs aching with every step. The trail was uneven, littered with roots and rocks that threatened to trip him up. He stumbled once, catching himself on a tree, but he didn't stop. The forest seemed to close in around him, the towering pines casting long shadows that turned the world into a maze of light and dark. Jake's mind replayed the events of the past hour in fragments. The bear's desperate eyes, the weight of the rope in his hands, the moment the poacher appeared on the ridge. It felt surreal, like a dream he couldn't wake from. But the gunfire was all too real. Another crack split the air, followed by a sharp pain in Jake's shoulder. He cried out, stumbling to the ground. Blood seeped through his jacket, warm and sticky, but he didn't have time to assess the damage. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself up and kept running. The trail opened into a small clearing, the ground carpeted with moss and wildflowers. Jake's eyes darted around, searching for cover. His gaze landed on a cluster of boulders near the edge of the clearing, their jagged edges offering some semblance of protection. He dove behind the rocks, pressing his back against the cold stone. His shoulder throbbed, and he could feel the blood soaking through his shirt. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay focused. The poacher's footsteps grew louder, crunching through the underbrush. Jake held his breath, every muscle in his body tensed. He could hear the man muttering to himself, the words too low to make out. Suddenly, a deep growl rumbled through the air. Jake's heart leapt. It was the bear. The poacher froze, his muttering replaced by silence. Jake peered around the edge of the boulder, his eyes widening. The grizzly stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive form silhouetted against the trees. Its fur bristled, and its lips pulled back to reveal sharp teeth. The poacher raised his rifle, aiming at the bear. Jake didn't think, he acted. Grabbing a fist-sized rock, he hurled it at the man with all his strength. The rock struck the poacher's arm, and the rifle fired, the bullet going wide. The bear roared, charging forward with terrifying speed. The poacher stumbled back, fumbling to reload. But before he could, the grizzly was on him. With a swipe of its massive paw, it sent the rifle flying. The man screamed, scrambling to his feet and running toward the trees. Jake stayed frozen behind the boulder, his breath shallow. The bear watched the poacher disappear, its ears swiveling as it listened for any sign of danger. When it was satisfied, it turned its gaze to Jake. For a moment, they stared at each other. Jake's heart pounded as he waited to see what the bear would do. It had every reason to attack him. He was injured, vulnerable, and easy prey. But instead of charging, the bear let out a soft huff and lumbered toward the forest. Jake watched it go, a mixture of relief and awe washing over him. The forest was quiet now, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Jake leaned against the boulder, his body trembling. He was alive, for now. But he knew this wasn't over. The poacher would come back, and next time, he might not miss. Jake forced himself to his feet, clutching his injured shoulder. He needed a plan. The bear might have scared off the poacher for now, but it wouldn't stick around forever. If Jake wanted to survive, he'd have to outsmart his pursuer, and fast. Looking around, Jake noticed faint claw marks on the trees leading deeper into the forest. They were fresh, likely left by the bear. An idea began to form in his mind. The bear had saved him once, even if unintentionally. Maybe it could help him again. With no better options, Jake followed the trail of claw marks, his steps unsteady but determined. Jake's feet barely touched the ground as he followed the bear's trail deeper into the forest. Every step was painful, his shoulder bleeding through his shirt, the wound still fresh from the poacher's bullet. He staggered, his mind barely registering the pain. There was no time for that now. His only focus was surviving, and the bear, the very creature that had nearly cost him his life, was now his only hope. The forest was dense, the trees towering above him like silent sentinels. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the ground beneath his boots was uneven and treacherous. Despite the pain in his body, Jake pushed forward. The claw marks on the trees were his only guide, leading him deeper into the wilderness. For a brief moment, Jake let himself think about what had happened. The bear's sudden appearance, the poacher's chase, the desperation he'd felt when the poacher had fired at him. It all seemed unreal, as though he were trapped in some kind of nightmare. But he couldn't afford to dwell on it. The poacher was still out there, and Jake was certain that if he didn't get ahead of him, he'd be dead within the hour. The claw marks on the trees became more frequent, more pronounced. Jake's chest tightened. The bear wasn't far ahead. And though he knew it was foolish to trust the animal again, he had no other choice. He stumbled over a root, nearly falling, but caught himself just in time. His breath was ragged now, each inhale like fire in his lungs. He hadn't realized how far he'd gone without rest. But there was no stopping now. The bear could be anywhere, and the poacher was still after him. Jake's mind raced, strategizing, plotting his next move. He needed to find a place to hide, somewhere the poacher wouldn't find him, somewhere he could rest and gather his strength. But the deeper he went into the forest, the less he could hear. The world had become eerily silent, as though it were holding its breath. And then, he heard it. A deep, rumbling growl, distant but unmistakable. The bear. Jake froze, his heart skipping a beat. The growl was so close, he could feel it vibrating in his chest. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to flee, but he knew better than to run from the very creature that could rip him apart in seconds. Instead, he crouched down behind a thick bush, his pulse racing as the growl grew louder, closer. The bear was near, very near. Then, there was a snap of a twig. Jake's heart lurched. The growl turned into something more primal, more dangerous. The bear wasn't just hunting, it was warning. Jake's fingers curled around a jagged rock at his feet. He didn't know what good it would do him, but it was all he had. The bear stepped into the clearing, its massive form emerging from the shadows. It was as large as Jake remembered, its fur matted with dirt and blood. But it wasn't just the size of the bear that made Jake's breath catch in his throat, it was the look in its eyes. The same eyes that had once looked at him with something like understanding were now full of something far more dangerous. Jake's grip on the rock tightened, his fingers white from the strain. The bear sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring. Its gaze shifted, scanning the area. For a moment, it seemed to sense him, its head jerking in his direction. Jake held his breath, praying that the bear wouldn't spot him. The bear's ears flicked back, and it huffed in frustration. It didn't see Jake, but it wasn't giving up. The growl returned, deeper now, vibrating the ground beneath Jake's feet. The bear was on the hunt, and Jake was its prey. Every instinct in Jake's body screamed at him to run. But there was no point in running. He knew the bear would catch him in seconds. So instead, he stayed still, his eyes fixed on the bear's every move, waiting for the right moment. The bear's eyes narrowed, and it turned its head, seemingly aware of something else nearby. Jake followed its gaze, and a sense of dread filled him as he saw the poacher step into the clearing. Jake's heart pounded. The poacher was armed. The bear was wild, and no matter how many times it had spared Jake's life, there was no telling what would happen if they both faced off. The poacher raised his rifle, his eyes fixed on the bear. He was about to pull the trigger, and there was nothing Jake could do to stop him. But then, to Jake's surprise, the bear moved. It was fast, faster than he could have imagined. With a deafening roar, it charged at the poacher, its massive paws striking the ground with terrifying force. The poacher barely had time to react before the bear collided with him, sending him flying backward. The rifle went off, the bullet missing by inches. Jake didn't wait to see what happened next. He had to move. He couldn't afford to hesitate. With every ounce of strength left in him, Jake sprinted toward the tree line, his feet slipping on the damp ground. He knew the bear was distracted. He had only a few precious seconds to get to safety. But as he pushed forward, a sharp pain shot through his leg. He collapsed to the ground with a gasp, the world spinning around him. The poacher was down, but Jake wasn't safe yet. The bear would be back, and this time, it wouldn't be alone. Jake struggled to his feet, his body shaking with exhaustion and pain. His leg was bruised, possibly broken, but he couldn't afford to stop. The poacher had a rifle, and if Jake didn't get away, he'd be dead. His vision blurred, but he kept moving, dragging himself through the underbrush. His mind was fuzzy, his thoughts scattered. He needed to find shelter, but the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly. The trees towered above him like giants, blocking out the sunlight. He couldn't keep running. Then he saw it, an old cave, hidden in the shadows of a cliff. It was small, barely big enough for a man to fit inside, but it was his only chance. With all his remaining strength, Jake crawled toward the cave, his body screaming in protest. He didn't know if the bear was still following him, or if the poacher was dead, but he had to make it inside. Finally, he reached the cave. Jake collapsed inside, gasping for air. The darkness was thick, and his vision was fading, but he felt a strange sense of safety. For the first time in hours, he could finally stop running. But he knew the danger wasn't over. The poacher wasn't the only threat in these woods. The bear had made it clear that it could be both an ally and an enemy. And Jake had no idea which side it would choose next. Jake lay motionless on the cold stone floor of the cave, every breath a laborious effort. His shoulder throbbed, and his leg pulsed with pain, but that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was the uncertainty. He didn't know if he was safe. The bear could be lurking outside, waiting for him to make a move. The poacher was still out there, and Jake had no doubt he would come looking for him. And even if the poacher was dealt with, the wilderness itself was a constant threat. He wasn't just fighting for his life now. He was fighting to survive in a world that had shown him just how fragile life could be. The cave was dark, its only light filtering in from the small entrance. It was silent except for the occasional drip of water and the sound of his own ragged breathing. Jake's eyes were heavy, and his body screamed for rest, but he knew he couldn't afford it. He had to keep moving, keep thinking. The poacher wouldn't rest until he found Jake, and the bear might not either. He needed to make a decision, one that would change everything. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Jake couldn't tell. The pain in his body kept him on edge, but it was the silence that made his mind spin. Had the bear left? Had the poacher given up? Or was this just the calm before the storm? Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the entrance of the cave. Jake's heart stopped. It wasn't the poacher. The bear was back. Jake's body froze. His mind raced. Was this it? Would the bear come inside, finish what it started? Or was it here to protect him? The growl was louder now, closer. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he pushed himself up, wincing with every movement. His hands gripped the jagged stone at his sides, and he forced himself to stand despite the pain. He had no weapon, no plan. He couldn't outrun the bear, and there was nowhere to hide. The bear's head appeared in the entrance of the cave, its massive form outlined against the dim light. It was a towering silhouette, its fur bristling, eyes glowing with an intensity Jake couldn't quite understand. But instead of charging, it paused. For a long moment, the two of them stared at each other. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Jake's mind was racing, his heart beating faster than it ever had before. What was the bear thinking? Why hadn't it attacked? And then, in an instant, the bear lowered its head. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Was this the end? Had the bear finally decided to claim him as prey? But instead of charging, the bear moved forward slowly, deliberately. It stepped into the cave, its enormous form looming over Jake. He took an involuntary step back, but the bear didn't stop. It lowered its massive head once more, but this time, it nudged Jake's injured leg gently with its snout. Jake was so stunned, he couldn't even react. The bear, this powerful, wild creature, was showing him compassion. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The bear wasn't his enemy. It had never been. The true threat had always been the poacher. The bear had only attacked to protect itself, to defend its territory. Jake stared into the bear's eyes, a strange understanding passing between them. The wildness in the bear's gaze softened. It wasn't just a predator, it was a creature trying to survive, just like Jake. The tension that had been building between them seemed to dissipate in that moment. The bear wasn't a threat. It was something more, something Jake couldn't quite put into words. But their moment of peace was short-lived. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush reached Jake's ears. The poacher. The bear heard it too. Its ears perked up, and its body tensed. The growl rumbled from deep within its chest, a warning that sent a chill through Jake's spine. There was no time to think. The poacher was closing in, and Jake was too weak to run. He could hear the crunch of his footsteps getting closer, and he knew that if he didn't act now, everything he had fought for, everything the bear had spared him for, would be in vain. The bear let out a low growl, stepping closer to Jake as if to protect him. "Stay behind me," Jake whispered, unsure if the bear could understand his words. But somehow, in that moment, he knew the animal would. The poacher's shadow fell across the cave entrance. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the man stepped into the cave, rifle raised. "Thought you could hide, huh?" the poacher sneered, his eyes locking onto Jake. He stepped forward, but the bear didn't budge. Instead, it bared its teeth, growling louder now. The poacher hesitated, eyes flicking to the bear and back to Jake. He could see the fear in the poacher's eyes, the realization that he wasn't facing an easy target. But the poacher didn't have time to think. In an instant, he aimed his rifle at the bear, his finger tightening on the trigger. Without thinking, Jake lunged. He grabbed a jagged rock from the floor of the cave and threw it with every ounce of strength he had. It struck the poacher's rifle, knocking it from his hands. The poacher stumbled back, cursing. But before he could regain his balance, the bear charged. It was a blur of muscle and fur as it collided with the poacher, knocking him to the ground. The poacher screamed, but the bear didn't stop. Jake scrambled back, his legs shaking beneath him. The bear was relentless, and Jake knew the poacher wouldn't survive. But as the bear moved in for the final strike, something stopped Jake. The poacher had been a threat, but in that moment, Jake realized something. Vengeance wasn't the answer. He had survived, not by violence, but by a twist of fate, by the bear's mercy. With a roar, the bear backed away, its eyes locked on Jake. It gave him a long, intense look before slowly turning and disappearing into the woods. Jake stood frozen, the echoes of the bear's roar still ringing in his ears. As he watched the bear fade into the distance, Jake realized that he had been given a second chance, an opportunity to live, to change. And though he didn't know what lay ahead, he was no longer alone. The forest had its dangers, but it also held wonders, and for the first time, Jake felt that he might be able to face them, no matter what. The poacher, bruised and broken, was left behind. But Jake knew that this battle was over, for now. And as he made his way back to civilization, he carried with him a profound understanding. Survival wasn't just about fighting, it was about learning when to fight and when to let go. And sometimes, even the wildest creatures had something to teach you.